to Commission Ed, the Air Force Officer Podcast. Here we explore the training and development of America's leaders in the application of air power and the profession of arms. The views expressed are those of the hosts and do not reflect the official policy or position of the United States Air Force, Department of Defense, or the U.S. government. The mention of companies by name is solely for the purpose of discussion and should not be implied as endorsement.
Welcome back to another episode of Commission Ed, the Air Force Officer Podcast. I'm Colin Slade.
And I'm Reed Gann, and we're your hosts for Commission Ed.
So today's episode is the promised interview with Captain Jordan Woods, which was originally intended to be just a standalone episode, but as the interview progressed, I felt that the conversation here would be a great capstone to what we've been discussing about what an officer should be, officership in general, and the goal of creating someone who has the potential for command, even at the highest levels of the joint force.
Yeah. And Colin, you and I talk a lot about how important knowing yourself is to being a good officer. And more than most, or maybe any interview we've done, I think this is a great lens that everybody can use to look at themselves and ask if they are as self-aware as Jordan is.
Yeah.
Yes, every single person that we've talked to has been a fantastic person, great interviews, good officers. But the things you and Jordan talk about are incredibly intimate and vulnerable and hard. And his ability to do that well, to discuss and describe his feelings and situation, and to show how well he knows himself and how that guides his decision making. I don't know that we've had as good of an example of that in any of our interviews. So I'm really looking forward to Jordan's interview and your discussion that we're going to share with the audience today.
Yeah, absolutely. Many takeaways from this conversation that I think everyone listening to this is going to be able to benefit from, covering the gamut of coming into the Air Force, the developmental process, the emotions that surround the separations process. And so let's leave it there. And with that, we'll turn it over to Captain Jordan Woods. Captain Jordan Woods, my friend, my mentor, my buddy, my colleague, my protege.
Yes.
What else should we call you?
I don't know. Your twin in life. I don't know what you'd call me.
All of those things.
All of those things.
Man, I have been looking forward to this conversation for a long time.
As have I.
For a huge number of reasons, but most recently because you just pushed the button, right?
I did. I officially applied for separation from the Air Force.
Wow.
Yeah.
That is freaking awesome. Super scary at the same time,
Yes.
right? Okay, and we're going to get into that. But before we do, we need to introduce you to the audience, right?
Okay.
People need to know who you are, get a little bit of an understanding of the gravitas of this situation, right?
Yeah.
So let's go back. Tell us who you are. Where'd you come from? How'd you grow up?
Sure.
What led you into the Air Force? Your experience over the course of your number of years in the Air Force, highlights, lowlights, those kinds of things. Just give the audience an idea of what has led you up to this moment.
Sure. So I grew up in northern Utah, and I grew up in a family that was, very patriotic. And really the only member that served in the military was my grandfather on my mom's side. But he never really talked about it. It was a short period of time that he served. And so I'd seen pictures of him. But I grew up in a family that loved, being who we were and loved just being a part of this great country. And so I always grew up, with a love of our country. And so that was kind of the beginnings of my desire to serve in the military.
Yeah.
And I served a mission for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Argentina.
Okay.
Loved my time there and grew even more to appreciate what I had being an American. And after coming home from my mission, I started school up at Utah State University and My dad was an engineer, so I'd always thought maybe I was going to be an engineer, but I was like, no, I got to try and pave my own way, and I don't want to, necessarily be an engineer. So I started studying just a bunch of different things, trying to figure out what I wanted to do. But after just a couple of semesters, I started getting drawn more and more back to engineering, something that I was familiar with. I'd always loved taking things apart, putting things together. Yeah. So I ended up starting back towards engineering classes, but I have always had a strong desire to be a pilot, to fly.
Okay.
So my dad, like I mentioned, was an engineer, and he actually worked for Boeing, one of his first jobs after he graduated from Utah State. And he worked on the B-2 bomber. And so
awesome.
For the very early ages of my life, I grew up in Washington State for a few years when he was working with Boeing on the B-2. So I always remember going to air shows, watching the Blue Angels, Thunderbirds, and being around aviation. And so I always had a desire to be involved with aviation. So I took a couple aviation classes up at Utah State and happened to be sitting next to somebody that was like, hey, you want to be a pilot? I was like, yeah, that'd be awesome. I'd love to be a pilot. And he's like, have you ever heard of ROTC? And I was like, nope, never heard of it. So he's like, after this class, come with me. So I didn't really know what was going on, but I was like, okay.
This was another cadet?
Yeah, another
Awesome.
cadet. At this point, I had no idea what ROTC was.
Right.
Right. So
neither did that cadet.
Right. He's actually a pilot today.
That's awesome.
Same cadet now, captain. So anyway, he pulls me into Captain Smith's office. I know it's a generic name, but that's legitimately what his name was, Captain Smith.
That's awesome.
Sat me down in a recruiting role and told me all about ROTC and about the opportunity to be a pilot in the Air Force. Piqued my interest, and I registered for ROTC classes. So that's kind of how I was introduced to ROTC and the whole concept of becoming an officer in the Air Force. But it played to a lot of the things that I had already had kind of building in myself, and it just worked out. The timing was right. It felt right. And that's how I got into ROTC. And so I did end up studying engineering. I didn't continue down the aviation class pathway just because it's so expensive to fly.
Right.
So graduated with a degree in civil engineering and did the ROTC while I was at Utah State. Loved every minute of it. Loved my time in ROTC and built friendships that I still have today.
Yeah.
With the cadets that I went through school with. And one of the things that kind of had a large impact on me was one of the cadre members, Captain Mitchell Cooksey. And he was a great mentor, somebody that I looked up to when I was a cadet. And, I thought, man, I would love to do what he's been able to do and come back and teach ROTC.
Right.
So that was kind of the beginnings of, all those feelings of wanting to be an officer and being in the military. Graduated from Utah State with my degree and became a civil engineering officer in the Air Force. So this is where our paths, I think, start to come together.
To really, truly align.
Yes. So I became a CE officer.
So you didn't become a pilot?
I did not.
Did you pursue pilot?
So I wanted to, but when I went through the DODMER process, so Department of Defense Medical Board, they said that I had less than ideal hearing of all things. So I grew up shooting guns. I love guns. And a few years before I went through the DODMER process, I was muzzle blasted, meaning we were duck hunting, me and my brother. We were shooting at the same duck, and my brother's barrel was close enough to my ear that it did some damage, I guess.
Yeah.
So I think growing up shooting guns and then that incident had an impact on my hearing. So I hear fine. But if you know anything about the medical process, they're going to look for anything that is a delimiter that says, you can't fly. So, so that was it.
Words to the wise, wear your ear pro.
Yes, wear your ear pro. Definitely. So I never had that opportunity. I had all the qualifications. I did really well at field training. Had a good commander's ranking, all the things that you've discussed before in your podcast, and was setting myself up to be a pilot. But then the DODMER process said, no, you're not qualified to be a rated officer. So didn't go down that path. So became a CE officer. First assignment was to Joint Base Andrews in Maryland and loved my time there. It was a time of growth, a lot of opportunity. Deployed for the first time out of Andrews to Kuwait, and just really enjoyed my time as a CE officer and learning that whole process. So.
And you got to Andrews in what year?
I got there in March of 2015.
Okay. I left Andrews in March of 2015 when I deployed to Jordan, right?
Yes. So if my memory serves me, I was in my office, or what I came to find out was my office, when I think I met you for the very first time.
Yeah.
And someone said, hey, this is, Lieutenant Slade. At the time you were a lieutenant.
Yeah.
And I think that was like really the only interaction. And it was
And I have no memory of it.
Yeah. So it was just a brief, like, he's on his way out.
Yeah.
And I didn't even know what that meant at the time that you were separating at that time. So, but yeah, that's...
Yeah, so I deployed, was gone for those 6 months, came back and immediately left the Air Force. I separated, right? And went off to do other things while you continued there at Andrews.
Yep.
You mentioned there was a deployment there. You went to Kuwait, right?
Yes.
And after that deployment, stayed at Andrews until when?
So I was there until June of 2018.
Okay. And so by that point, I had been 1 year back on active duty through the VLPAD program, Voluntary Limited Period of Active Duty, at ROTC at BYU Detachment 855, where I commissioned. And while I'm there, I've been there a year, we're losing some of our cadre members because they're getting ready to PCS, and we're looking to hire the next person. And I remember Colonel Hogan coming to me and saying, hey, we got a candidate that we're looking to hire as one of our cadre members. He's a civil engineer, and he's at Joint Base Andrews. Would you mind looking over his records? And I'm like, well, sure. I mean, I know the base. I know civil engineering. Let me see who this guy is as far as like what his paper record says. Had no idea who you were, right? Other than what was there on the record. And this is what I remember seeing on there. Number one in basically everything. And I'm like, wow, this cat's legit. I mean, number one strats, they can both mean nothing and they can mean everything, right?
Right.
And Reed and I have talked about the problems with the stratification system, but you actually had like a legit number one lieutenant within the wing or something like that, right?
Yeah.
And so you've done some really incredible things there at Andrews, and we're on the path to greatness. And here you were trying to go to ROTC because things hadn't changed yet, right?
No.
It wasn't looked on favorably. And that was kind of your experience when you first let the command structure know that you wanted to go ROTC and move off of the beaten path away from that number one strat and some of the other possibilities that were available to you. Is that all accurate?
Yes. So like I mentioned earlier, from an early time as a cadet, I had a desire to come back to ROTC, which is strange because I've never really wanted to be a teacher per se or an instructor. But what I learned in ROTC and the things that I developed in ROTC, I really appreciated in myself, and I wanted to share those experiences with other people. So I was working really hard to do my job, to learn my job as a CE officer, but kind of in the back of my mind, I knew that I wanted to come back to ROTC. And so when I let my commander know that was my desire, it wasn't a, no, you can't do that, but it was a kind of a questioning, like, why? Why do you want to do that? Because like you mentioned, at that time, ROTC was kind of looked on as, well, people go to die there. Their careers go to die in ROTC. It's not, something that you want to do. And so I actually had a conversation where my commander explained to me the high potential officer, the HPO.
Yeah.
It's kind of a unspoken, like, you don't know about it unless you know about it type of a deal. And basically was told, you're on a trajectory to be a high potential officer. You have an opportunity here to do some things and, make it, far in your career as an officer. And that all sounds amazing.
Right.
Right. But truly, like, in my heart of hearts, I knew I wanted to teach. I wanted to go back to ROTC and be an instructor. And so I just kept pushing it to the point where I even had my group commander, 06, sit down with me and be like, are you sure you want to do this? And I'm like, yes, I want to do this. But without getting into all the weeds, it was a long process. It took almost a full year to finally get the official notice, okay, you've been selected to go to ROTC. So I won't get into all the details about that, but it was quite the process to finally convince everyone that, yes, I'm of sane mind. I do want to do this. I do want to join or go be an instructor in ROTC.
Yeah, Reed and I haven't talked too much about the HPO thing. It's not really a system or a
No.
program. Like you said, it's unwritten. It's like a club within the club, right? And I personally don't know enough about it to speak intelligently to it.
Yeah.
But then again, I don't think that very many do, unless you've already been introduced and like brought into that fold, right?
Yes. Yeah. So, I mean, the interesting thing was my commander mentioned the high potential officer thing, the club within the club. But then there was a binder. Like, I'm no kidding, like, I'm going to pull out my HPO binder.
Yeah.
And so, I don't remember all the nitty-gritty details about it, but it was just interesting to have that conversation and say, you're basically foregoing this opportunity. And let me kind of lay out what this means for you career-wise.
Yeah, and let's call a spade, right? High potential officer, meaning potential for high rank,
Correct.
Fast track to 06, potentially even 07 and above.
Right.
I mean, the highest ranking civil engineer officer is a 2-star, right? So
Correct.
No chance that you would ever have become a chief of staff of the Air Force.
No.
But still, being able to be at the highest echelons of civil engineering and logistics and that for sure, and being at those centers of power where policy and decisions are being made.
Right. Yeah, and so that all sounded amazing. But what I really loved about being an officer was the ability to have an impact at the human level, like person to person. And not to say that, an 06 or an 07 doesn't have that potential, but it changes. The dynamic of being a leader at that level changes.
Mm-hmm.
And what I enjoyed and really appreciated about my ROTC instructor and other officers that I'd interacted with was their ability to have interest in me as a person.
Yeah.
And say, hey, I see something in you. I want to help you, develop that and become something better than you are today. And that's what I appreciated about my experience in ROTC. And that's what I wanted to give back to cadets, to other, aspiring officers. And so, yeah, the rank sounds amazing. All that recognition sounds amazing. But really what it boiled down for me was being able to connect and give back to developing airmen.
Yeah. And speaking from personal experience, because I was there, I watched it happen. And we should also say, you're sitting 6 feet across from me right now. We are in the same room. We're here in the basement of my house, here in the recording studio of Commission Ed, the Air Force Officer Podcast, right? Yes. I'm saying this because I was there to watch that happen. I can 100% say that is exactly what you did.
Thank you.
At the detachment. Watching you take all those lessons that you had learned through your time in the operational Air Force and bringing that to our cadets was phenomenal. Not only did you develop our cadets, but Jordan, you developed me. There were many a conversation with you at your desk and me on your couch, right?
Yeah. I have a couch in my office. It's pretty awesome.
Where we talked through these things. Like, it usually started with something along the lines of, what are we doing here?
Yeah.
But like, not stopping with just pointing out the problem, but how can we do this better?
Right.
How can we improve upon the situation that we've been given and do right by our cadets so that they can then do right by themselves and the airmen that they're going to go lead?
Yeah, exactly. And it was really validating. You mentioned this a little bit earlier when the Air Force finally recognized the importance of instructors.
Yeah.
And I'm so grateful that the Air Force is moving in that direction. And I've had people reach out to me since that announcement that the Air Force made and have asked, hey, what's your experience been as an instructor? And it gives me a lot of pride to be able to say it's awesome.
Yeah.
It's so cool to see these young cadets that want to be officers in the Air Force. They look up to you as an officer and they say, that's what I want to do. I want to be an officer. And to give them that foundation to become better officers. And so it was really validating when all that started to happen and, be able to look back and on those conversations that I had on my pathway to becoming an instructor to say, I wasn't wrong. And while I had this opportunity to become, 06, 07, whatever, for me, what I'm doing in ROTC has, in my opinion, a much larger impact than, me pursuing a really successful career, which I still feel like I can do.
Right.
Even having taken that path of becoming an instructor.
Well, see, that's a really interesting thing is that you left that potential behind to go to where officer careers die, right? Only to find that the Air Force recognized the value that officer instructors provide. So they resurrected that opportunity for you. Right? So not only just in general that officer instructors are good for the Air Force, but you were killing it, man. You were doing really well there in the detachment. You went to PME, to SOS. You did well there. Distinguished graduate, right?
Yes.
So continuing that trajectory of HPO, high potential officer, even though you had diverted from the path.
Right.
And yet here we are having this conversation today with you choosing to push the button.
Yeah.
And once again, give that up.
Yeah. Yeah, and let me just start by saying before we get into this part of the discussion, I'm kind of an emotional person, not just around this subject, but if I'm in my car and I hear a really good song, it may move me to tears, okay? Something that, I think some men are, I guess, afraid to talk about, but I'm, an emotional person and I don't mind getting emotional. So if during this conversation I get a little emotional, it's just kind of a warning that that's definitely a possibility.
You're saying it up front, and now it's not going to happen.
Yes, I'm hoping not, but no promises. So
yeah. So Jordan, let's get into it.
Okay.
So let's talk about the build up to the actual decision day, pushing the button. Let's talk about what happened before then. What were the conversations that you were having with yourself? We kind of already alluded to some of that, the potential for career success, the conversation that you were having with your wife, because you are married, you do have a family, you have kids. What was that like?
Yeah, so just like a lot of the decisions that I've made in my life, this wasn't something that I just came to overnight. You kind of alluded to that it was a process, that it took a long time. It took a long time, I think, especially for me personally, to come to grips with that decision to say, I really might do this. I really might separate from something that means so much to me.
At what point did that thought first arrive for you? Like, was it before you ever got to ROTC, or did you have that 20-year mindset even until you got to ROTC and you were working there at the DET? When did that first show up?
So I think it first showed up after my first deployment.
Okay.
Just because, so while I was deployed, my wife was pregnant with our second. And she went through, just typical being a mom of a young baby while she's also pregnant. A lot of struggles, right? And things that I wish that I could have been there for. I was really lucky and I was able to get back for the birth of my second child.
Oh, cool.
By 2 days.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so cutting it close. Home. So I was fortunate to be back for that, but it just kind of, started me thinking about, all the reasons why I wanted to be an officer, to mentor airmen, to be able to help, young airmen develop. In the back of my mind, I started thinking, well, what about my 2 sons? I've got 3 kids now. I got 2 boys and a little girl. What about my sons and my daughter? They need a mentor. And that's not to say that being an officer means that you're gone all the time. But in my particular career field as a civil engineer, we deploy a lot, especially in our early career. Yeah. And that's really the developmental years of my children. And so I think after that first deployment, just started thinking about being there for my kids. And so that's kind of where it started. And once we got here, so I'm from Utah, as I mentioned earlier. We're back in Utah. We bought a house, renovated the whole house, and really started falling in love with where we were living, with the people we were interacting with. We're closer to family. So all those things are starting to play on my mind. My wife is mentioning often, I love it here. I love our house. I love our neighborhood. I love the schools that our kids are going to.
Dropping all them hints.
Right, dropping these hints. But I'm also in the back of my mind saying, I agree. I like these things. So the whole time I've been in ROTC, we've been, like I said, back in Utah near family, and it's just kind of been building. But as you know, officer assignments are typically a year out.
Right.
6 months to a year. So, I'm about 2 years into my assignment, and it's really starting to weigh heavily on me, where I'm like, okay, it's decision time. I really need to decide, am I going to pursue another assignment in the Air Force, or dare I say it, should I separate from the Air Force? So I started the conversation with my wife. She'd already been dropping a lot of hints, and I had agreed with her on a lot of the things that she, loved and still do. And so that was kind of the beginning of our process, was just saying, hey, so we're about a year out from getting an assignment. And about the same time, you were going through exactly what...
The worst months of my life?
Yes. I mean, these conversations on my couch in my office are us talking about, you're trying to find a job. The VL pad time is coming to an end. You're, looking for a job.
I want to stay on active duty.
And you wanted to stay on active duty.
Yeah.
And so I'm like torn. I'm like, I have an opportunity here to just stay on active duty.
Yeah.
I have a job with the Air Force as long as I want it.
Yep.
I don't have to do much except continue to do what I'm doing to keep this job. And you're telling me, man, I wish I could be back on active duty. And I'm like, this internal fire is like, oh, man. So he's telling me he wants to stay on active duty, and I'm contemplating leaving, and I start to feel a little crazy. I'm like, why would I leave something that I love?
Right.
Like, I have a deep passion for being an officer and being in the Air Force, to pursue something that I don't really know exists, but I know it exists, but it's not tangible like my career is in the Air Force.
Right.
And so you and I are having these conversations. I'm having conversations with my wife, and it just honestly depended on who I was talking to, which fire was like raging, right? I was like, I'm going to stay in the Air Force. So I'm going to make a 20-year career out of this. But in my heart of hearts, as I really sat back and thought about what I wanted for myself and for my family, I think for a long time I kind of knew what the answer was.
Yeah.
And that I was, headed down that path to separation. And I think that the reason that it's been such a struggle for me is because I'm so passionate about what I do and the love that I have for being a member of the military. And so it's just been a long process of fighting, I think, really internally with myself to be okay with what I've done with my time in the Air Force, because there's something to be said about wearing the uniform every day. There's something to be said about walking into whatever the office setting is with other like-minded people that wear the uniform, that understand what it is we're doing on a big picture.
Yeah.
The day-to-day office stuff, regardless of what job you're in, that's all going to be the same. But there's something about the uniform and the flag on my shoulder that kind of just, I don't know, it just takes it to a different place for me. And it's been really hard to come to grips with that possibility of not doing that every day.
Yeah. And you mentioned these conversations between us started just before the pandemic hit, right? And so add that into the mix, the uncertainty that comes along with not only leaving the thing that you love, not only pursuing a career that you've never done before,
right?
But all the uncertainties that are going on with the economy, the health and wellness of our families. Both you and I have children with medical issues.
Right.
And so that weighs in heavily.
Yeah.
Especially because TRICARE has been so amazing for both of our kids, right?
Yeah.
And the idea of giving that up is so hard, so hard. And because of all of this, again, it has been a process. I can't even count the number of phone calls and text messages that you and I have shared on this one particular topic. I mean, we've discussed other things, opportunities, stuff that we care about, but man, the swirl around.
It's a good word for it.
Does Jordan separate, or does he stay in at least another assignment or a full career? And, through part of that, I managed to separate again, not because I wanted to, but because I had to, but found success, right?
Yeah.
And have been able to show you personally that it is possible.
Yeah.
Even in these uncertain times, coming off active duty as a civil engineer who then went to ROTC, you can still find a way, right?
Yeah.
And so that, again, factors into the calculus, seeing that there is this possibility of being successful in the civilian world. But man, do I really want to give it up? Because, I love it so much.
Yeah.
I hear you, man.
Yeah. It's crazy because the logical side of, the process of deciding to separate or not, I'm paid really well.
Yeah, you are.
As a captain. If you include what I get in benefits, you mentioned TRICARE, I don't pay for healthcare, right? I do by serving in the military, but if you look at, there's nothing else that compares to it. There's no other healthcare like it.
Right.
So some may argue that it's not the greatest healthcare, but man, the security of knowing that no matter what, like I'm covered, my wife's covered, my kids are covered. I mean, we went through a lot of health issues with my wife and our most recent baby. I would be swamped in medical bills had I not had TRICARE. So that logical side of my brain saying, are you crazy?
Right.
Why are you even considering this? Like, you're paid really well. You've got amazing benefits. You know, why would you even consider leaving something like that? And so, I mean, I could go down that rabbit hole for a long time, and I spent many days and private, conversations with myself trying to convince myself, like, yeah, you're crazy. Don't separate. Don't do this. But it really came back to what I felt in my heart and what I felt I needed to do as a husband, as a father. And I think often I kind of lumped all of those hats that I wear into wearing the uniform. I have a strong desire to wear the uniform, but I need to take that hat off for a second and think about being a dad and think about being a husband and think about the conversations that I've had with my wife surrounding deployments, surrounding time away from family. All those things just kind of played into the emotion of the decision. But I mean, I got there. It took a long time, but I think really what it boiled down to is I love this country. I love what I've been able to do as an officer, and I feel like I'm still going to be able to do that. My goals are to continue my service through the Guard or reserves, pursuing getting on with the Guard here in Utah. So I'll still be able to wear that hat. It won't be full time, but it's something that I'm going to still be able to do. But really, in 20 years or 25 years, when I look back on my life, are those deployments that I would have gone on, are those going to be the things that I'm going to regret? Or is it going to be that I wasn't there for my children and my wife when they needed me? And for me, that's kind of what it boiled down to, is my desire to be a dad and a husband trumped my, need to be in the Air Force. And so now it's just trying to find a way that I can continue to do what I love doing as a member of the military and as an officer, while still being able to provide the support and the needs of my family.
Yeah. So the way this ended up playing out is you had conversations with Nikki, with your wife, about we can't make the decision just yet. We need to wait to see what the next assignment is going to be. You felt that that was an important step to take.
Yeah.
I mean, you could have separated sooner than that, but you felt like there was reason to see what the Air Force had in store for you and then make the decision then, right?
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, and you and I had conversations about this where my active duty service commitment ended in 2020.
Right.
So I could have at that point technically separated, clear back then. But I love what I'm doing as an ROTC instructor. And so we wanted to go through the assignment process and have the opportunity to decide ultimately what we wanted to do after having gone through that whole assignment process again, just because we don't know what's going to happen. And one of the things that you had mentioned when we'd talked was you never know if something happens in your family where you need to stay in the Air Force, like there's really no other option, or there's no job opportunities, whatever it may end up being. Like, we need to go through that process, give the Air Force an opportunity to, give us an assignment that we feel comfortable taking and go down that road. So we did. We went through the whole entire assignment process. And yeah.
And that included conversations with Colonel Thaden, our commander.
Right.
Expressing your preferences, building out your development plan.
Right.
All of those things played into eventually receiving an assignment from, I should mention, you participated in the developmental team, the DT, you got a vector.
Yes.
Right? We don't need to go into the nuts and bolts of those things. We can talk about those things another time. But you went through all of that process to eventually receive your next assignment, which was what?
To Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana.
Which is actually a really great place.
Yes.
It's one of the lesser known secrets, great places, great bases in the Air Force.
Right. Yeah, not many people want to go up there just because I don't think they know enough about it. But
Yeah.
it's amazing. It's beautiful up there. So
Big Sky Country.
Yeah.
This is Great Falls.
Yep.
Great Falls, Montana. I've been there. It's beautiful. Yeah. You would have loved it, especially you
Yeah.
with your love for hunting and outdoor activities and that kind of stuff.
Right.
So once again, you're faced with, oh man, I would love this.
Yeah. Yes. And it's funny because like my wife and I had kind of already decided, okay, if we get this, or this, like we'll consider it.
Yeah.
But if we get anything else, like we're just not even going to consider it.
Can I know what this or this that you would have accepted?
Sure. Yeah. No. So I had actually applied for a job at Hill here in Utah. To keep us here in Utah. It's a 1 deep position.
All right.
But they didn't advertise the job. So without getting into the whole assignments process, it wasn't advertised. But I'd spoken to the commander at Hill and said, hey, sir, I'm interested in this job. Would you consider hiring me?
Yeah.
And he's like, we want you.
Okay.
We definitely want you. Let me talk to AFPC, the Air Force Personnel Center. Let me talk to,
Career field managers.
Yes.
Yeah. All the powers that be.
Yeah, yes, exactly. Let me get this ball rolling. We definitely think that you'd be a great fit. And it worked out, honestly, for my career as a civil engineering officer, like perfectly.
Mhm.
So I've done pretty much everything as a CE officer except readiness and emergency management.
Yeah.
And that's what I would have done. I'd been the flight chief of here at Hill. And so it would have fit perfectly in with my career development as a CE officer. It would have been 2 years. And it also would have worked out just as far as I knew I've been in ROTC for 3 years. Deployment is hot. Like I'm going to get deployed. And I'd even mentioned that to the Hill Air Force Base commander. I said, sir, I'm assuming that this is a deployable position. He said, yeah, absolutely. And I said, well, I've been in ROTC for 3 years. I'm going to go on a deployment. He's like, yeah, it's a safe assumption. So that was a conversation I had with my wife. Hey, if I take this job at Hill, I'm definitely going to get deployed.
Yeah.
And I've also got the career field managers from the CE world telling me, hey, you also need to consider a 365 remote.
Yeah.
A 1-year short tour. And so in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, okay, if I go to Hill, I can do a 6-month deployment. My wife will be either living with family or 5 minutes away from family.
Yep.
She'll have the support she needs to get through that 6-month deployment. And then I'd be able to be back here in Utah for a little while. And then at the end of my time at Hill is when I was kind of being told, hey, this is when you're going to need to do your 365 short tour. So that's when I would have done it. Again, I could have left my wife here in Utah in the same home, same schools that my kids are already in, while I go on a short tour and have all the family support she needs. Like, it was perfect.
Yeah.
And it would have worked out really, really well for us as far as staying in the Air Force, having those benefits, and also developing my career and doing the things that the Air Force needed me to do to be successful. And so went through that whole process, talked to AFPC, talked to the assignments team, and told them my desires, told them that I'd talk to the commander at Hill. And it was a pretty brief conversation. Well, we were not really considering filling that position, but we'll let you know. So I sent an email, per their request, explaining why I felt like it was going to be a good thing for me professionally and also for my family.
Yeah. And good for the Air Force.
And good for the Air Force.
Because that has to be a consideration, right?
Yeah. So in that squadron, there's only one other active duty officer, and it's the EOD flight chief. And so it would have been me and one other captain, 2 captains in the entire squadron that are the only active duty officers. And so I had spoken to him often, and he'd kind of expressed it'd be really awesome to have another, CGO bro around. So, yeah, I think it would have been really good for the Air Force. It would have been really great for my family. But it didn't come to fruition. So,
and sometimes that just happens.
Yeah.
The wickets, the structure, the construct, whatever you want to call it, the cards just don't fall in your favor. And not that Malmstrom is a bad place to go, but
not at all.
It wasn't on the places that you had pre-designated that you would be willing to go.
Yeah. I mean, in the assignments process, I had put Malmstrom on there because I knew it was a little hidden gem. But it was mostly for the reasons of, if something happens and we do need to take an assignment, we'd rather be somewhere that we want to be rather than just some random place. So it was something that we'd considered and, talked about and said that, this is something that we could do. But when it came down to it, and when the assignment actually dropped, it was kind of a gut check moment. We'd already kind of made up our minds what we were going to do. But then I second guessed myself for another 72 hours.
Yeah, you did.
I very quickly went through like a year-long process in 72 hours.
All over again.
All over again of just ups and downs and all the emotions and, conversations of, let me talk to my wife, well, what if we took it? There's still that part of me that wanted to just say, yeah, let's take it. Let's do this. Because it's exciting. It's really hard, and you can attest to this. Moving a family is not fun.
Right.
And doing it often is not fun. But starting off in a new place with new people is always exciting from a professional side. And, something that I would have looked forward to. And other people that have been on your podcast have mentioned this. When you deploy, there's something about being deployed that you can't explain to anybody that's not deployed.
Mm-hmm.
And you come home and you're so excited to be home, be with your family. But there's always in the back of your mind, I want to be deployed.
Yeah.
And I think Reed has actually even mentioned that struggle of like, am I a bad husband and father for wanting to be deployed, like for wanting to be away from my family? And so, yeah, I mean, I would get excited being like, oh, like I'm excited to deploy again. I'm excited to interact with, CE airmen again. But yeah, I mean, I just had to stick with what I felt deep in my heart. And so here we are. I last week officially applied for separation from the Air Force.
Yeah. So before we get into the emotions that came after the fact,
sure,
I do want to talk just a little bit the nuts and bolts of that 72-hour period that you had. Like, how much time do you actually have to accept or decline? We hear the term the 7-day option.
Yeah.
Talk us through your experience working through that.
Okay. So typically how the assignment process works is the assignments team will assign all the officers to their billets, and they will give the commander of the individual that's about to PCS, permanent change of station. I'm used to explaining acronyms because I've got cadets that have never heard them. So
that's right. We've got members of the audience that have never heard it. Yeah. So it's all good.
Yeah. When I talk to my family, I use a lot of acronyms, and they're like, we don't understand like half of what you said. So anyway, the commander of the individual will receive a RIP, an assignment RIP, that will basically give the commander an opportunity to talk with the individual and say, hey, this is your assignment. It hasn't officially dropped, but it kind of gives the commander an opportunity to kind of gauge where I'm at, where the individual's at, and to say, are you going to take this, when the assignment drops? And if there's, significant issue with the assignment, it gives AFPC and the assignments team an opportunity to change things before things are official.
Yeah.
So that happened, early last week, got a notice from my commander, said, hey, your assignment is going to come in the next few days. This is what it is, Malmstrom Air Force Base. What are you thinking? And at that point, my 7-day option hadn't started.
Okay.
So I had said to him, sir, I need to talk it over with my wife. We need to discuss it, think about it, pray about it. And then when we talk again next week, we'll give you a final, decision. And so he allowed me that time to discuss it with my wife. And then I get an email from AFPC that says, hey, your assignment has officially dropped. So meaning they've assigned me, Malmstrom.
And it's not in the email that you see the assignment. You have to go into virtual MPF to actually see what it is.
Right. But I knew, obviously, because my commander had given me my assignment RIP, what it was going to be.
Yeah.
So, no surprises. So, go into VMPF, virtual MPF, and I see, Malmstrom Air Force Base. And that's in that email where you do like an initial briefing that says you have 7 days to decide officially if you're going to voluntarily separate or you're going to take the assignment.
Yeah. It's either or. There's no other option. It's just those two things.
It's not, well, take this one back and give me something else, and then I'll decide. Like, that's it. And, I got that email. I went in, looked at the assignment. I already knew what it is. But, again, it's just like all those emotions come flooding back. And it's like, okay, this is real. Like, I literally have 7 days to decide what my future is going to be. And it's really emotional. It's really hard to know what to do. And to my wife, she's amazing. She has been super supportive through this whole process. I know what we want, as a couple and as a family. But as a professional, as an officer, I know what I want.
Yeah.
And ultimately, I want my family to be happy, and I want her to be happy. But there is that professional side of me that wants to take the assignment, be an officer, and continue down this path that I, have a lot of passion for.
So you took those 7 days. Did you take all 7 days?
Took all 7 days. Yeah.
How many times during those 7 days did you pull up the separation screen and hovered your mouse over that button?
I mean, every day, multiple times a day. I mean, so I was still doing work, and so I'd be sitting at my computer doing work, and I'd get, I'd need a break or whatever from work.
Yeah.
And I'd be like, I'm just going to go look at this, So I'd look at my assignment rip. I'd read every line that I'd read, 50 times. I'd go into the separation portal or whatever you want to call it. And I couldn't, during those 7 days, until I absolutely had to, I just couldn't do it.
Even though you kind of already knew the answer, right?
I already knew the answer. I already knew what I was going to do.
You had called me. You had told me the answer.
Yes.
And I'm texting you saying, dude, what's up?
Yeah.
Tell me the story. What's happening?
I got a text from you the day that my 7-day window ended, and you're like, so, what's going on? And I still hadn't done it. And even my commander, Colonel Thaden, had said, hey, if you know what you're going to do, just do it.
Yeah.
Don't wait.
You slowly peel that Band-Aid off.
Yeah. And so the actual separation process, you have to go into VMPF and click on this link, and you literally fill out a bunch of questions that says, do you understand what you're doing?
Yeah.
And then you finally have to hit submit, and there's paperwork that you have to fill out and some documents that you have to submit. And, so I hit that button, and it says, thank you. I don't know why it says thank you,
right.
But it's like, thank you for applying to separate.
Thank you for your service.
Right. But that screen popped up when I hit submit, and I instantly just burst into tears. It was the craziest thing. I knew what I was doing.
Yeah.
I knew what my decision was. I'd already made it. But when I officially, hit that button, and the screen said, thanks for submitting your survey or your application to separate, I just burst into tears. And my wife was in the other room, and I don't know if she could hear me or not, but she knew what I was doing. She knew what I was working on.
Yeah.
So I'm sitting there sobbing, trying to be quiet, and she's like, babe, are you okay?
Oh, yeah.
And through my tears, I'm like, yeah, I'm okay.
You're the sopping mess of
tears.
And
I even took a screenshot of it and sent it to you in a text and said, what just happened, basically. I am so emotional, and it's been like that since I, pushed the button. It's been just, life goes on during the day. I'm busy with kids and work and life, but when I'm in my quiet time and sitting alone to my thoughts, it just creeps back in, those emotions.
Yeah, it hasn't been a one-off. You were telling me that on your drive here.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so I had about an hour drive here, and at first I was just listening to the radio. Then I turned it off, just trying to think through some of my thoughts as I, knew I was coming to talk about this. And same thing, it's just a flood of emotions and a lot of happy memories. It's strange because when I talk to people that are not members of the military and I tell them what I'm doing, they're like, oh, that's awesome. That's really exciting that you're going to be able to do, what I want to do, what I want to pursue. And it's not like just quitting a job.
Right.
And maybe for some people it is. But for me personally, it wasn't just like quitting my job. I mean, my dad was in a career that he was really successful at, but didn't love per se, and didn't love the people that he was working with. And I remember the day he quit his job, he was elated.
Yeah.
He was so excited. I just remember him being like, I don't know why I didn't do this 10 years ago. He was free of, and I don't feel that way. I don't feel like I'm free of anything. I don't feel like, I feel like I'm giving up something.
Yeah.
I'm not quitting something that I don't enjoy.
Yeah, that was my experience. Definitely this second time around.
Yeah.
I felt it way, way more than the first time I separated. And just so happened that in the lead up to my separation, because of my son's diagnosis with type 1 diabetes and the effect that had on us as a family and me as a father, Amy as a mother, and in our marriage, we actually started going through family therapy, couples counseling, not that because there was anything wrong
right.
with us, but we needed somebody to help us work through those emotions.
Right.
Because we had to give something up. Type 1 diabetes doesn't go away, right?
No.
And that counselor, bless her, she was so phenomenal and really, really helped us to work through some of these things. But she put a name to it, what I was going through, because like you, I knew that the separation was coming. I wasn't happy with it. And that was part of the conversations, especially because of like the health care and how am I going to take care of my family? And now this diagnosis that my son has. And so she put a name to it. It's grief.
Yeah.
There is a grieving process that we go through in the lead up to actually pushing the button, making the decision to separate, but then thereafter. And the transition is a process of going through grief.
Yeah.
The denial, the frustration, the anger, the feelings of loss.
Yeah.
But also, looking ahead. There are some opportunities.
Yeah.
But it's hard to see them through everything that you're going through, this roller coaster that you relive on a daily basis.
Yeah.
Because of the choice that you've made or the choices that have been made for you.
Right.
So totally get it, man.
Yeah.
That's what you've been going through. And that's what most people who truly love what they do, whether the military or something else, have to give it up, are going to experience is that grieving process.
Yeah. And not only, individuals that decide to separate, but I've been a part of a lot of retirement ceremonies.
Yeah.
For individuals that have served 20, 25, even 30 years in the military.
And how much more poignant is it, right?
Yeah. And there is definitely, even in those people who have served honorably the full duration of a career, grief and sadness, obviously excitement for the next step in their lives. But I've talked to individuals that have retired and they say almost unanimously, I miss it.
Yeah.
I miss my brothers and sisters in arms. And I think for me, kind of as I mentioned, the mentorship and the opportunity to interact with other officers and other airmen, that's why I love it. I've never had a job anywhere else where I felt that level of camaraderie and brotherhood and sisterhood that I feel with other members of the military. And it's something you don't even have to say.
Yeah.
You can be, wherever in a grocery store and I may be in uniform or I see somebody that's wearing a hat that identifies them as a military member and I immediately feel like a deep connection with that
flag
person.
on their backpack.
Yeah.
They're wearing tactical khaki pants. Or
Yeah, it's hard to know if they've been in the military or not just because they're in tactical pants.
But yeah, you can identify those people and you feel something for them.
Yeah. And from a very early age, I always felt a sense of pride and gratitude towards people that served in the military. And so to be voluntarily deciding to leave that, something that I feel so deeply like within my person, it's hard. It's really hard. And it's not an easy decision, for many reasons, but I think besides the money, besides the benefits, besides all of that, it literally is hanging up a part of my life that is like ingrained in my being. And I don't think there's really anything else out there. I mean, maybe that you could say that about a job where you feel so deeply tied to what it is you're doing on a big picture.
Yeah. It really becomes part of you. It becomes who you are.
Yeah.
And your life is defined by those things that you do and the people that you're with. I mean, that connection is so strong and so powerful. And to have to sever that.
Yeah.
Oh, it's so painful.
It is. So, I mean, I know that I'm not the only person that's gone through this. I know that there are other
Nor will
people.
you be the last.
No. And I know that there are a lot of people, maybe even listening to this podcast that are contemplating separation. And I can't tell anyone individual what to do. But you just have to go through the process, like you said, of grief, figuring it out for yourself, what's best for you and your family. The Air Force is going to be fine.
Yeah.
There's a part of you that wants to be like, well, I've got so much to do for the Air Force. Really, I don't. I do. But the Air Force is going to be fine without me.
Yeah.
When I told my commander, Colonel Thaden, sir, I'm going to separate, he did what a commander should do and told me, we're going to miss you, and the Air Force is losing a great asset. But the Air Force is going to be fine, and the Air Force will go on, and I will go on, and I will be successful in whatever I, end up doing. but I do feel like I'm leaving something that's a part of me, and it's hard.
Yeah. And the honest truth, man, is that's going to be the case for a long time, if not forever.
Yeah.
Yeah. You never actually finish the transition.
Right.
You can't.
Yeah.
You have devoted yourself so deeply to a cause like this, and to have done so during your formative years.
Yeah.
Where you're really growing into a fully fledged adult, and so much of what you experienced in the formation of your family was tied to the military, to the Air Force. There's no way you're ever going to be able to fully move past that.
No.
And you know what? That's okay.
Yeah. No, I 100% believe that it's a good thing. It's a good thing that I'm not just so quickly, walking away from it and being like, good riddance.
Right.
Because like you said, it's been such a part of who I am today and will be in the future. I mean, I've learned things and done things and had experiences that you don't get anywhere else in the military. And it's those things that have made me who I am today and will make me successful in the future. So I'm grateful, honestly. And I was talking to my mom when I kind of finally made the decision that, separation is what we were going to pursue. And this was actually from a good friend of mine who went through a very similar situation, got off of a long deployment, had an opportunity to take another assignment, and they decided to separate. And I talked to him on the phone and via text, and he said that he still to this day struggles with, not being in the Air Force. But he said one thing that finally helped him was to finally tell himself and feel like you've served your country.
Yeah.
You've done what a lot of people don't have the opportunity to do. It wasn't 20 years, it wasn't that, full career, but there's still honor in 5 years of service, 6 years of service, 25 years of service. There's still honor in what you were able to do with your time in the Air Force. And that really helped. And that's, kind of what I mentioned to my mom, because she knows how much I love what I do. And I just said, I'm really grateful that I had the opportunity to serve in the Air Force as long as I have, and for the opportunities and the lessons that I've learned. And she's, was really grateful that I was able to express that. She said, I'm really glad that you feel that way, because as your family, we're so proud of what you've been able to accomplish and the things that you've done. And my wife is amazing. She's really helped me through this whole process. And she's even, in those moments of like, are we doing the right thing? She's like, Jord, if you want to do this, if you want to take another assignment, like, let's do it. Like, I'm there to support you. Like, I'll figure it out. We'll figure it out. And I'm really grateful to her for having supported me in that way. But yeah, this has definitely been a family decision. It hasn't been just, what I wanted to do. I'm doing this, for my family and with my family.
Yeah. Love it so much. So I want to wrap things up here. You haven't separated yet.
No.
So you don't know exactly what's going to happen over the next 180 minus a few days, right? Yeah. You've got a lot of out processing that you have to go through.
Right.
You have to find your next set of employment. You got to palace chase into the Guard. At least that's the hope.
Right.
Right. So there's a lot of things that are on your plate over the next 6 months or so.
Yes.
Of the things that you see ahead of you, though, what do you most look forward to?
It's a great question. Honestly, I look forward to the opportunity to pursue exactly what me and my family want to pursue. What I mean by that is, in the Air Force, while it's not prescribed exactly what I need to do, it's pretty well laid out. As a CE officer, especially, I think it's similar in other career fields. This is what you do as a CE officer. You do this job, you do this job, you do this job.
Yeah.
And you're kind of mentored or guided along this path. And there's variances that, you talk to any CE officer, any other officer, and their paths are all different.
Yeah.
But they're all the same. And the pinnacle of what my Air Force career could be is pretty well defined. Like, I know what it looks like.
Yeah.
And I think I'm most excited for the unknown, shocking as that may sound. I'm excited to build on something that I'm ambitious about and excited about. I do have other passions. The Air Force isn't my only passion.
What?
The military, right? And so I have other things that I'm excited about, other goals that would have been more difficult, had I decided to stay in the Air Force. So I think I'm excited about those opportunities. I'm excited to see what comes in the next 5 to 10 years with my professional growth. Like I mentioned, I've got a lot of experiences and skills that I've gained in the Air Force that I feel are going to be really valuable outside of the Air Force.
Yeah.
Because I'm looking forward to using those tools and finding ways to continue my passion of mentorship and building up other people around me just in a different capacity. So maybe a little bit in the Guard, but also just in my career, my future career.
Yeah. If you look at the arc of what you've experienced here, yes, there's some uncertainty, there's some grief, there's some frustration, but here we're seeing there's also hope.
Yeah.
And, I talked about this at the end of the 2020, the short episode there titled Hope for the Future, right?
Yeah.
There is hope for the future.
Absolutely.
Whether you're in the Air Force or not, whether there's a pandemic or not, regardless of what is going on in the world around us, we can have hope that things are going to work together for our good, especially if we are being intentional about it and if we are preparing ourselves and our family and the people around us to be successful. And we're officers, for crying out loud.
Right.
That's what we do, is we stare conflict in the face and we say, there is a solution here and I'm going to find it.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. And the great thing about being an officer and about being a member of the military is that it gives you tools and resources that are applicable everywhere all the time.
Yeah.
Like you said. And I'm really excited to be able to utilize those things that I've developed in building something that's going to be not only good for me and my family, but also good for my community. And it's something I'm very passionate about, is, helping lift those around me. And, even during a pandemic, there's opportunities to lift people. And so I'm excited.
There's probably even more opportunities.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, if you love service, what better time and place to be of service to others than in the middle of a crisis?
Yeah. And that's, what I had to kind of wrap my head around, is just, one of the reasons I loved being in the military is being able to serve others, but also be a part of the, military service. But you can do that anywhere.
Yeah.
You don't have to be in the Air Force to serve. So.
Yeah. Well, Jordan, there's literally so much more that we could dig into, but let's be respectful of your time as well as of the audience. But if people want to get in touch with you, right? If they're contemplating a similar thing, maybe they're hovering over the separation button right now too. They're going through that same flood of emotions. They're reliving their career every day. They're looking at the possibilities. How do they get in touch with you if they want to pick your brain and have a similar conversation?
Yeah, so I'll just give you my personal email address, jordwoods@gmail.com, jordwoods@gmail.com. Feel free to link that in the show notes, as you say.
Yeah.
And I would give you my .mil, my af.mil, but I don't know how long that's going to exist. So I'm willing to talk to anybody anytime, now or even 2 years from now. If they hear this podcast 2 years from now and, struggling with similar feelings, I'm happy to talk through it. I was and am eternally grateful that you went through it before I did, Colin. Yeah. And that I was able to reach out to you. I think it was one of the things that helped me the most, was being able to have somebody that understood, exactly what I was going through, and to be able to connect at that level and say, dude, I get it.
Yeah.
But you're going to be okay.
Yeah. And that's my point, my friend. If I could do it, you can do it. And then if you can do it, anybody can do it. I mean, we don't want everybody to leave the Air Force. Please don't everybody just rush to virtual MPF and drop that separation. We need good people in the Air Force, but good people will still be good people outside the Air Force.
Yes.
They can still succeed. There is that hope. Yeah. So please don't go this alone.
Yeah.
Reach out to Jordan, reach out to me, or talk to others that have gone before you or are contemplating the same path. Please don't walk this path by yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. The vast majority, I think it's 80% of military members separate early. So it's a pretty large number of us that, decide to do it. So there's definitely a resource out there for those that need it. And I'm one of them. I'm happy to walk somebody through the emotions of this last year.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, Jordan, last question.
Okay.
What does it mean to be an officer?
Okay, so this is one of the things that I was thinking about the most on my drive, because this is what I'm most passionate about, is being an officer. And I think for me, being an officer is being present. It's being a leader to individuals that don't know they need to be led. And I think it's being able to look at a group of individuals and see those that are struggling, to see those that are doing well, and to see potential in people otherwise don't see it in themselves. And I think being an officer is using that ability to see people on a human level and be able to pull them out of whatever it is that's holding them back from being successful or doing what they truly could be good at. And I think being an officer is having that human connection. I mean, you can talk all day about managing resources and getting the mission done, but 99% of my interactions as an officer have been on the human level.
Yeah.
Have been, what's going on? Talk to me, tell me what you're struggling with, or celebrating their success.
Yeah.
And for me, that's what being an officer is all about.
I love it so much. Captain Jordan Woods, still captain.
Still captain. Always a captain.
That's right. Captain forever.
Yes.
Thank you so much for being willing to come on the show, to be vulnerable, to talk through this incredible ride and roller coaster and the peaks and valleys, the excitement, the lows that come with contemplating separation, but showing that there is hope and that it's going to be okay.
I really, really appreciate this opportunity, and it's something that I told my wife, hey, I really feel like I need to do this. It's part of my grieving process is to be able to verbally out loud say exactly how I feel about this whole situation. And so I appreciate the opportunity to do this. And I hope that my experience will help someone else in their decision making.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Appreciate it.
Hey, Colin, what an amazing interview. I want to thank you for being vulnerable with us today. That's one of the only ways you can really form connection with other people, is to take some risk and to expose those deep secrets, those tender bits of us. And I really thought you did that, and I appreciate that. And I want to recognize how hard that can be.
Sure.
So I want to thank you for that. A couple things I want to start off with, Colin. Just really moving, poignant interview. And before we get too far, I want to make sure that, Colin, you and I are not judging anyone else or their decision making. I know Jordan isn't doing that. I want it to be really crystal clear. You can be a good husband, father, spouse, partner, wife, mother, and be an airman or guardian. You can do that. And I don't think for a second Jordan is saying that people who stay in are not good parents, husbands, fathers, partners, etc. I think what he is saying is exactly what he said. He couldn't be the kind of father he wanted to be. And that is a very individual conversation between everybody and the people they love. And I've had to make that call with opportunities that have been presented to me. Does that mean that the people who do choose those things are bad parents? No, absolutely not. Everybody and their situation is very different. I just want to make sure we get that out at the outset of our discussion, because I just kind of want that out of the way. I don't want people judging themselves. Don't compare you to anybody else. Compare you to you and your standards when it comes to this kind of thing.
Yeah, for sure. There's nothing in Air Force policy or other governing regulations that are going to help you to solve that at large for a large group of people. There's nothing that in like the airman leadership qualities that we've discussed previously that say when or how you should choose to separate from the Air Force or choose to stay in. You're not going to find that. So what you need is kind of like what we talked about in the introduction to this episode, is that self-awareness, that knowledge of who you are as a person, as an individual, as an officer, as someone who has relationships with other people, both in and out of the Air Force, and have a regular conversation with those different groups of people, including yourself, about what does success look like. We've had that conversation here on the podcast many times before. Nobody's going to be able to solve it for you. It is your responsibility and something that is going to look different over the course of time.
And that leads me to another thing I wanted to talk about, Colin. You and Jordan were going through very similar circumstances around the same time.
Yeah.
And he described that well. I thought he did a really good job of describing the emotions, the difficulty, the mental gymnastics he's going through every day as he sorts through this very difficult decision that he's going through. The thing that I thought about is this was happening to two people at one unit at the same time.
Yeah.
How many people are in your unit, Colin, there when you were in ROTC from the staff perspective?
Yeah, there were 6 officers and 3 enlisted, so not very big.
But still, you think about it, that's a fairly sizable portion of your organization going through challenging circumstances.
Yeah.
So let's think about that from Colonel Thaden's perspective, from a commander's perspective.
Uh-huh.
The thing I was thinking about is imagine a squadron of 200 people. That's a pretty normal size for a squadron.
Yeah.
Do you as a commander know them? And do you know them well enough that you can know and understand what's going on in their lives? Do you love them? And do they know and love you enough to be able to bring you their challenges, their deepest, darkest secrets, their struggles, their victories? And are you going to be able to help them through that? Because that's the job.
Yeah.
Because in a squadron of 200, some large percentage of them are going to be going through this kind of stuff.
Yeah, especially in a day and time like right now where COVID still continues to be a thing. The Air Force is potentially eyeing force management programs that are going to invite people to leave or force them to leave. And that places a huge emotional burden on every single person who is faced with that. And if you as a commander aren't tuned in to how this is going to affect them at home, in their job performance, or anything else, then how can you effectively lead them to accomplish the things that the Air Force needs them to do? I don't know that you can.
I would argue if you aren't tuned into that, then what are you doing in the chair? I mean, that is the job. Squadron commanders do not do the mission. I mean, yes, you may see some every once in a while participate, but the people are their job. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to command. It's lonely at the top. It's brutally hard. And I hope that something, Colin, we haven't talked a whole lot about, and I want to convey here. I would really like to give everyone a little bit of patience for commanders.
Yeah.
The closer you work with a commander, the more often you see them in their decision making, the more you participate in administrative punishments or non-judicial punishment actions or any of that sort of thing, you recognize how hard and how lonely that job is. And this is exactly the kind of thing that really illustrates that. One of Colonel Thaden's highest performers is thinking about separating from the military. Who is Colonel Thaden going to go talk to about this? You know, fortunately, I know he has a spouse and maybe he can confide in her. Is she going to understand at the deepest levels what that feels like? Jordan describes how unless you've deployed, you can't really know. It's similar with a lot of decision making that we have to make. And I'm not saying squadron commanders are completely alone, right? There are other commanders, but it is a hard job. And I hope that the more people see about how hard it is, that they can start to generate a little bit of patience for the decision making and the place that you have to be in. But I loved how Jordan described how hard this was. I really felt it. And I hope that our audience did too. And it made me think about, man, command is hard. And that is the job. That is the job.
It really is. And putting this into the broader context of what we've been discussing over the last month or so, if the goal of an officer is to be a commander, especially at the joint force level, imagine that multiplied by now thousands of people. Multiply that by entire nations who may be feeling that kind of thing. And it is your responsibility to lead effectively, even in that kind of situation.
Yeah. There's a reason there's not a whole lot of them.
Yeah.
I think it takes a real special kind of person. And that's been my experience, Colin. When I've interacted with people at that level, you get a sense of, wow, these people are sharp. They are smart. There is something about them. So yeah, I really enjoyed the interview today, and I appreciate you and Jordan taking the time.
Yeah. And I think that the interview shows where that kind of person begins to be developed within the Air Force. it was brought up over the course of the interview that Jordan had been identified early on as someone with a great potential for command. And we haven't talked much about the HPO, the high potential officer system, the club within the club, if you will, before on this podcast. And
it's because we're not in the club, Colin. We don't know.
Exactly, right. Yeah, and that's what I wanted to say, is that we're not going to discuss it in very much detail now either, because we are not members of it. We don't know that much about it. I mean, we've mentioned before the unwritten rules of the Air Force. Well, this one is completely unwritten.
Yeah.
Like, you're not going to find the HPO thing. You're not going to find a regulation on it anywhere.
I mean, it's like Fight Club, right? It's not talked about. We all kind of know it's a thing. And Colin, before we recorded, I relayed this. I have seen one person talk reasonably openly about the HPO system. And then the next year they got promoted to brigadier. I was like, oh, okay. That's the only reason that person could say something about it, because apparently they had been in the club. That never happens. I don't know anybody who talks about it. It's just kind of like this image, or it's a thing, I guess. You and I don't know. We don't know the details. We don't know how it works.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's out there, I think.
But the reason I bring it up is because Jordan had been, I guess, identified for it. At least somebody saw that sort of potential in him, and that he could have eventually attained much higher levels of rank. Yeah. He could have been a commander at very high levels in the Air Force. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I want to caveat that and have a little conversation here about that within certain career fields, there are glass ceilings that will keep you from eventually becoming a joint force commander, even if you have all the capabilities of being successful at that level. Jordan is a civil engineering officer. Within that career field, our highest ranking civil engineering officer is a 2-star. And then there's a small handful of brigadier generals that go along with that. So what does that mean? That means that even if Jordan was an HPO, high potential officer, even if he eventually was able to lead and have command at the wing or even the numbered Air Force type of level, he was never going to get a 3rd star and be able to serve as a joint force commander at the highest levels of the Air Force. He was never, ever going to become a chief of staff of the Air Force. It's just not possible. And I want to have a conversation of why that is. Is it good? Is it bad? Are we indifferent to it? What are your thoughts there, Reed?
So one of the things, and we should explain, right? There's no legal reason why a CE officer couldn't become the chief of staff. It's not written down, right? And general officers, they can, I mean, as the name defines, lead in almost any category, right? They're generally qualified to lead just about anything. So this is one of those club rules that we have set. So glass ceiling, granite ceiling, whatever you want to call it, it's a thing.
Yeah.
It is absolutely a barrier. For intelligence, we have a 3-star, and for a long time, a pilot was the most senior intelligent officer in the Air Force, General Otto, before he left. So this concept for me, I'm at peace with. And let me describe why. I've told the audience before, and we've explored this before, Colin, how I was at Al Udeid Air Base at the Combined Air Operations Center when President Obama ordered the U.S. to fly into Syria and begin conducting operations against ISIS. And that was a very big deal. It's not very often where the Air Force does kind of what the Air Force was built for, from okay, we've got an adversary nation. There's a bunch of deliberate targets there. We're going to build strike packages of 50, 60, 70 aircraft, all different kinds from all different nations. We're going to roll deep and we're going to go blow some stuff up, especially not in the last 20 years. You could argue a little bit in Libya, yes. And, maybe the first few nights of the invasion of Iraq, but by and large, we own the air. At least for the last 20 years, we've absolutely owned the airspace. There's no real threat to our aircraft, and we're just kind of blowing up whatever we want. At the time, Syria had an integrated air defense system. So they had anti-aircraft artillery. They had surface-to-air missiles, and all of these systems talked to each other. And it was one of the most formidable airspaces on the planet. That means aircraft get shot down. And they had an Air Force. Now, none of those things happened that day, but the point was we were preparing for people to get shot down, aircraft and people to be lost in striking these targets. And I played a part in that. I was in the room where it happened, where the plans were made, the operational picture was described, targets were described, everything. And the night before, I'm in the room, we're all having the final mission brief, and we're just about ready to deliver all of these plans to the flying units. And a very distinct thing happened as I was sitting there, standing there in my ABUs, and 90% of the room was wearing a flight suit. I realized that a significant portion of the people in the room the next day were going to be strapped in and flying this mission that I just built for them. And at that time and place, I became at peace with having operators who conduct the business of the Air Force in charge of the business of the Air Force. For me, that was an academic exercise. It might as well have been. It was very real, and I don't want to minimize that. But I wasn't strapping in, crossing the line, and going to fly the mission. And in my perspective, there is a knowledge, skill, and ability gap that I cannot close because I haven't done that last, whatever percentage you want to call it. I can't close that gap. They can describe it. They can show me footage. They can share pictures. They can let me listen to the audio. I mean, we've got all these ways for you to experience it, but it's different. It's different than being there. And I want someone who's got that extra bit to be making those decisions about that kind of thing. So it was at that point that I'm like, I get it. It's a pilot's Air Force and I know why. And I'm totally at peace with that. But that's one guy's perspective. So Colin, I've been talking for a while. What do you think?
I think about what we have discussed very recently about there being no career field in the Air Force that is limited to just officers. So project yourself, 20 years into the future, things look different. They've removed the requirement for the bachelor's degree. We've got enlisted pilots, and that 90% that's in that room that you were in are actually enlisted operators who are then going to go lead that fight. And so you have a much smaller group of officers who then are then responsible and aware of what it takes to do operations. And now you have to pull leaders, commanders from that smaller group who more than likely have more in common than they do right now because there's fewer of them and because they do many more of the same things. And because of that shared experience between those who are in operations and those who are in support or other areas of the Air Force, there's a greater ability for you to develop commanders, especially at the Joint Force level, from a variety of different career fields. And there's nothing that requires an operator to lead the operational Air Force. I get what you're saying, and I don't think that you are wrong, but I do think that there is a potential to set things up in a way that you can have a career support officer lead a joint force. I know it's possible. The question is that what we want?
And that is probably the biggest flaw in our whole plan, because I would think that would be a bad idea. I'm an intelligence guy. I'm an operator. I'm in the 1 series AFSC, and more warfare is moving into the information sphere. We've talked about that before. I still think that would be a bad idea, is having an intelligence officer be a joint force commander. I just think there's enough that I haven't experienced. And maybe that's the biggest flaw, is we're not making enough people with the requisite experience in our proposed system. And I hope that everyone who is not an operator is not, bringing out the pitchforks and, ready to burn me at the stake. This is my experience, and that's all it is. But it was quite formative, and it really made me at peace with not only my role in the whole thing. But I understand why we've set these internal rules, right? Again, Colin, these are our rules for our club, but we're not the only ones to do this. Look at who the Army promotes to their leadership positions. Look who the Marines promote.
Yeah.
Look at the Navy, right? They're promoting the people who are doing the core missions that are at, the heart and soul, the identity of their service. Look at General Nordy Schwartz. He was the chief of staff when you and I joined, Colin.
Yep.
He was a mobility pilot, and that was a huge deal, right? Not a shooter. He was a cargo hauler. And even that was a sufficient departure from, quote, the norm that it generated conversation. So, yeah, it's something I've made peace with and is definitely something that I think we would have to examine in a proposed system.
Well, and I don't propose that we are going to solve it right now, but I do think that the conversation should be had of what does it take to create a joint force commander? Does it have to be somebody who has been strapped into a kinetic fighter aircraft, or can it come from someplace else? I mean, concentric circles further away from that particular capability.
Yeah.
We want the best commander, not the best tactician, to be the one who leads the operation.
Totally.
And the best commander may come from someplace else.
Yep. But if they don't have the knowledge, skills, and abilities, I don't know. We could keep going on this all day, Colin. We're kind of on different sides of this coin, but having the conversation matters. And I also think being honest with our brand new lieutenants matters a lot.
Yes.
I don't like it when people stand up in rooms and be like, one of you could be the chief of staff someday. Okay, thanks. Technically, yes, but let's not set everybody up for that bar, because pretty quickly they're going to realize that it's possible legally, but why are we putting that measure on ourselves for everybody? I just think it's a bad idea. Anyway.
Yeah, for sure.
End rant.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to pick up a different rant right there. We brought it up in our previous episode about the development of Air Force officers, that the vast majority of us are never going to attain to that. Even if we're capable of it, even if we would be good at it, you can only have one. There's only a very select few that are going to make it to the highest levels of command. And so the rest of us then have to go through what Jordan is right now of separating, either early on in their career like he is, or eventually choosing to retire. And what retirement may look like at that point is something that we're not going to discuss right now. But the fact is that everybody takes off the uniform at some point, and that as it stands right now, there's a whole host of emotions that come along with that. You heard it in the interview. We've discussed it previously with my personal experience of separating from the Air Force and exploring some of the reasons that you've put forward, Reed, for why you might want to separate. And kind of the point that I want to drive home there is that the Air Force should do a better job of preparing people to separate and avoiding the unnecessary burden of all of these emotions and the processing of grief and all those kinds of things that come along with whether or not, when and how you are going to separate.
Yeah. Colin, you and I, we talked for almost an hour before we recorded this episode on these points. Yes, I do think we can do a better job of preparing people. And I do think that starts at the very beginning. Commissioning and accession sources are generally pretty positive. Hoorah, let's go blow some stuff up. They're really motivating. And some of the most meaningful experiences I had during my commissioning were centered around balanced approaches to joining the Air Force. Hey, don't forget your loved ones. Hey, this is going to end someday. I'm glad you're really excited, but striking that balance. But I don't see that in a structured way or a formalized way. We do spend a whole lot of time and energy recruiting and retaining, and we could probably spend more on ensuring people are ready for that transition when it comes.
Well, let me put it into a slightly different context. For example, in the corporate world, there's a great amount of time and resources spent on the recruiting process because it's very expensive to hire somebody and to have them not work out for the company. There are statistics that go with that, something around like $60,000 per hire. And you want to be able to recoup that investment by having that person stick around for a while. And, to be frank, most companies don't spend a whole lot on the process of developing people so that they can leave the company. Kind of the expectation is that you're going to stick with the company for a long time.
Mhm.
Obviously, that's not always the case. People move around within the corporate world all the time, but there is generally an acceptance that if you're a high performer, if you add value to the business, you can stick with the company for as long as you want, as long as the company is able to afford you and there's a path of growth for the company and you within it, right? But that's not how the Air Force is set up. We're not a company. We're not a for-profit business. And it is understood before anybody ever puts the uniform on that there will be a day and a time where you will have to take it off, that you will leave the Air Force. And there is an expectation that once you have left the Air Force, you are going to have another career outside of it. And so if we are different, which we are, because we're not that corporate business, plus we are a profession of arms, we have different responsibilities while wearing the uniform than you would see in the corporate space. I believe that the Air Force and the Department of Defense in general has a greater responsibility to prepare all people who wear the uniform for that transition. And that's why TAP exists, the Transition Assistance Program, which is a congressionally mandated program that everybody has to go through. It's just ineffective. And what I would want to see is a much greater expansion of the TAP program, as well as other things like employment with industry, the UE program, that is better preparing officers and all airmen for that transition. And then the other piece of that is that the transition should not have to be a one-time thing, but allow for people to transition back and forth between active duty, the Guard and Reserve, and back into active duty again. It shouldn't be like it is right now, where once you leave active duty, you're gone and you never can come back, which once again is that source of all of the emotions and the grief that people have to pass through as they consider their separation.
Yeah. And we, again, are at odds on this point a little bit, Colin. I don't know that I know enough about why you can't transition back and forth, but I think I have an idea. And I think it's because of the nature of what we do. It requires a deeper human connection. We've talked about, Colin, the only thing worth killing and dying for is the love of the man and woman to your right and left. And I wonder if the system were that permeable, if you could move back and forth very easily, if it would come at that cost of connection. I don't know that answer, right? This is a really hard problem, and I don't know that we've explored it sufficiently to understand it. And maybe it's something we can continue to look at. But I'm worried that there's a potential that we wouldn't have that deep, meaningful connection, which is required for us to do the things that are required of us, the taking of human life, life and death decisions, that sort of thing, if it were just another job. I'm worried that it would make it just another job. I've not gone through the transition. I've not even thought about it. And so I recognize my lack of authority to speak on this matter. This is a hard one for me. I think it's worthy of our discussion for sure.
Yeah, and that was the point that I wanted to make. It's just that you've not been in a position where you've had to consider the transition more seriously. I mean, I was the first one that really forced you to put some thought to it when we had our discussion last year about what your reasons for separating might be. That was the first time that you really had to think about it.
Yeah.
Where I've now gone through the transition twice. And
you weirdo. There's nobody who's done that.
And through my experiences and being in and then out and then in and out again, feeling that the way that things are currently set up, the system, the policies, or whatever you want to call it, that's preventing me from being on active duty when I want to and I'm qualified to be so. And the Air Force had a need at a time, they don't need me now. There's just no way to make that happen. And we're doing that to ourselves. We own this. These are our rules. We control who gets in. We also control who gets out. We can fix this if we really want to, but we are not going to get to a point where we want to unless we have a conversation about it. So that's really what I wanted to bring it up for.
Awesome. Anything else, Colin? I thought the interview was fantastic. It's just so much there. I think it really provided a really good capstone to our whole discussion about officership and how it could look and, the real emotions that are involved for people.
Yeah, and the interview with Jordan shows what is probably more likely to happen for what's going to happen for the vast majority of our audience. They are going to come up to a point where they have to consider the transition, even if they're having an incredibly successful career and they have that potential for command. They're most likely going to have to separate. And so it's good for them to have that front of mind, be considering that. And I love that Jordan was willing to be that example for us.
Yeah. So big shout out to Jordan Woods. Thanks for joining us on this incredible interview. Great interview. Anything else before we wrap up this week, Colin?
That'll be it for me.
All right. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Commission Ed.